Major breaking news: an attack has struck the Russian capital. This unprecedented event marks a severe escalation in the conflict, with explosions reported in central Moscow. In the pre-dawn darkness of a Moscow winter, the detonation of an explosive device reverberated through a quiet street, shattering windows and claiming 3 lives. Among the dead were 2 police officers. Within hours, an official from Ukraine's military intelligence, the GUR, conveyed a stark message to the Associated Press. This was a Ukrainian operation, and the officers were targeted for their participation in Russia's war. This strike at the heart of the Russian capital, following closely on the heels of a car bomb that killed a high-ranking Russian general in the same area, marked a dramatic and dangerous escalation in a conflict nearing its 4th year. It was a visceral demonstration that the war, once confined to the battlefields of Donbass and the cities of Ukraine, now held the potential for violence to penetrate the core of Russian power. As emergency crews examined drone fragments scattered across the Moscow region from a separate, massive aerial attack that saw Russian defenses down 172 Ukrainian drones overnight, the symbolism was inescapable. The front line, it seemed, was everywhere. This eruption of violence in Moscow unfolded against the most delicate diplomatic backdrop since the invasion began. In Florida, after marathon talks, American and Ukrainian negotiators had finally hammered out a detailed 20-point plan aimed at ending the war. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, in an unprecedented briefing, revealed the contours of this draft proposal, which was simultaneously being presented to Russian envoys for review. The plan represented a monumental effort to bridge seemingly unbridgeable gaps, intertwining security guarantees with complex economic and political compromises. At its most contentious heart lay the future of Ukraine's eastern Donbass region, where Russia has captured most of Luhansk and about 70% of Donetsk, and continues to insist Ukraine relinquish the remaining territory. The American proposal sought to break this deadlock with a novel concept, transforming these war-torn areas into a demilitarized free economic zone monitored by international forces. President Zelensky emphasized that any such arrangement would be contingent upon a national referendum, placing the ultimate decision in the hands of the Ukrainian people. We are in a situation where the Russians want us to leave the Donetsk region, and the Americans are trying to find a way so that it is not a way out, Zelensky stated, framing the U.S. effort as a search for a face-saving format for both sides. Equally complex was the question of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Europe's largest, which remains under Russian occupation. The American proposal suggested a 3-way consortium with Ukraine, Russia, and the United States, each holding an equal stake. Ukraine, however, balked at the notion of direct commercial partnership with the aggressor state. How can you have joint commerce with the Russians after everything? Zelensky asked, countering with a proposal for a U.S.-Ukraine joint venture, where the American side could independently decide how to distribute its share. Beyond these thorny issues, the draft plan contained sweeping provisions: a Ukrainian army maintained at 800,000 strong in peacetime, specific security guarantees mirroring NATO's Article 5 to be enshrined in a separate bilateral pact with the United States, a commitment to hold post-agreement elections, and a colossal $800 billion global reconstruction package aimed at attracting investment into Ukraine's technology, energy, and industrial sectors. The mood in Kyiv was one of cautious, weary hope. As one Ukrainian official noted, consensus had been found on most points, but the most difficult matters concerning territory and the nuclear plant would require decisions at the very highest level of leadership. While diplomats exchanged documents, the war on the ground took a decisive and brutal turn towards economic strangulation. The southern port city of Odessa, a historic jewel on the Black Sea and the lifeline of the Ukrainian economy, found itself in the crosshairs of a sustained Russian campaign of annihilation. A relentless barrage of missiles and drones targeted its port facilities, storage reservoirs, and critical energy infrastructure. The aftermath was not merely structural damage, but an environmental catastrophe. Strikes caused a massive sunflower oil spill from damaged storage tanks, contaminating the shoreline, killing wildlife, and forcing the temporary closure of the Pivdeni port for cleanup. Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister Oleksiy Kuleba warned that Russia was attempting to cut Ukraine off from the sea with a focus so intense that he declared, "The focus of the war may have shifted towards Odessa. The strategic intent was transparent." Before the war, Black Sea ports, including Odessa, handled over 70% of Ukraine's exports, and the nation has remained among the world's top 5 exporters of wheat and corn throughout the conflict. By systematically destroying this gateway, Moscow aims to shatter Ukraine's economy, choke off its foreign currency earnings, and break its resilience. President Zelensky accused Russia of sowing chaos and trying to restrict Ukraine's maritime access in retaliation for Ukrainian drone attacks on Russia's so-called shadow fleet of tankers used to circumvent oil sanctions. The economic warfare was two-way and expanding. Ukrainian naval drones had struck shadow fleet tankers near Turkish waters and, in a significant reach, claimed a strike on a Russian-linked tanker in the Mediterranean. In late November, Ukrainian drones hit the Caspian Pipeline Consortium terminal near Novorossiysk, damaging jetties and disrupting exports of Kazakh oil, a vital source of Russian transit fees, with delays expected to last for months. This brutal contest over the Black Sea and the shocking strikes in Moscow formed the immediate context for a far more ominous strategic shift emanating from the Kremlin. Since the initial invasion in 2022, Russia's nuclear posture has evolved from a doctrine of defensive deterrence to one of active, offensive intimidation. This transition is not merely rhetorical. It is being operationalized through concrete deployments, doctrinal revisions, and explicit preparations for nuclear testing. In November, during a special session of the Russian Security Council, Defense Minister Andrei Belousov justified preparations for potential nuclear tests, citing Moscow's view that U.S. actions were undermining strategic stability. The Kremlin, having withdrawn from the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 2023, has instructed its defense ministry and Rosatom, the state nuclear corporation, to ensure technical readiness for tests at the Novaya Zemlya site. As retired Colonel Mikhail Kodarinok noted, such tests with kiloton-class devices require minimal preparation and could serve both as a potent strategic signal and as technical preparation for the combat employment of nuclear munitions. This saber-rattling is accompanied by a relentless showcase of new delivery systems, such as the nuclear-powered Burevestnik missile and the Poseidon underwater drone, which President Vladimir Putin has hailed as unique and uninterceptable. Many analysts view the timing of these announcements as more significant than the weapons themselves, interpreting them as a calibrated response to Western pressure and a reflection of Moscow's frustration. The theoretical framework for this escalation is being articulated by Kremlin-aligned security experts who argue that traditional defensive nuclear posturing has failed to deter Western support for Ukraine. Figures like Dmitry Trenin, Sergei Karaganov, and Dmitry Suslov contend that to coerce the West into negotiations, Russia must instill tangible fear by demonstrating a credible readiness for nuclear use, even contemplating limited strikes against states supporting Ukraine. This concept of escalate to de-escalate finds practical expression in the professional military literature. Retired Major General Vyacheslav Kruglov emphasizes maintaining maximum readiness of nuclear forces, while Admiral Alexander Moiseev has theorized about the selective, limited use of sea-based non-strategic nuclear weapons against an aircraft carrier group or critical maritime infrastructure as a means to compel de-escalation without triggering a full strategic exchange. State Duma Deputy Andrei Gurulev has publicly argued that nuclear use does not necessarily lead to Armageddon, stressing the distinction between tactical and strategic weapons and asserting that credible nuclear employment would strengthen Russia's international position. This dangerous theory is being translated into a disquieting reality on NATO's eastern flank in Belarus. Since 2022, Russia has systematically constructed the infrastructure for a forward-based nuclear capability. Satellite imagery reveals hardened shelters, ammunition storage, and barracks near Osipovichy for the nuclear-capable Iskander-M missile systems of the 465th Missile Brigade. A short railway line connects this site to a modernized 12th Gumo repair and maintenance base, a potential storage site for tactical nuclear warheads. Joint Russian-Belarusian exercises in 2024 rehearsed a wartime 30-minute decision-to-employment cycle with nuclear munitions pre-positioned near launch platforms for immediate use, The escalation continued with the announcement of plans to deploy the new Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile to Belarus. With an estimated range of 5,500 kilometers, the Oreshnik is capable of delivering both conventional and nuclear warheads to targets across the European continent. Construction is already underway at a site in the Slutsk district, south of Minsk, designed to host this system. While framed by Minsk and Moscow as a defensive measure for the Union state, the forward deployment of combat-ready nuclear assets during an active war represents one of the most provocative shifts in European security since the Cold War. Crucially, targeting an employment authority rests solely with the Russian military political leadership. Belarus plays a secondary, enabling role, allowing Moscow to distribute political responsibility while retaining ultimate control. This physical deployment is codified in Russia's updated nuclear doctrine, approved in November 2024. The revised Basic Principles of State Policy on Nuclear Deterrence significantly lowers the threshold for use and expands the range of potential adversarial conditions. It now explicitly covers attacks on Belarus as a potential trigger for a Russian nuclear response and broadens the definition of an adversary to include coalitions of states or any country supporting actions against Russia, a clear reference to NATO and Ukraine's backers. The doctrine also reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in response to reliable intelligence of major aerospace attacks, including missiles or drones crossing the Russian border. This doctrinal shift, combined with the forward deployments, represents a coherent and calculated strategy of nuclear intimidation designed to fracture Western resolve. The objective, as articulated by its proponents, is to instill a paralyzing fear of escalation in Western capitals, thereby delaying weapons deliveries, constraining Ukraine's operational planning, and ultimately coercing a settlement that recognizes Russian gains. Some analysts, however, interpret this relentless nuclear posturing not as a sign of strength, but of underlying weakness and frustration. They argue that Putin's reliance on mafia-style intimidation tactics is an attempt to distract from the Russian military's grueling, costly, and slow progress in Ukraine and its inability to project decisive conventional power. The Atlantic Council's Stephen Blank posits that by constantly brandishing his nuclear arsenal, Putin risks highlighting Russia's conventional limitations, a vulnerability underscored when former U.S. President Donald Trump derided Russia as a paper tiger. The reverberations of this dual escalation conventional brutality in Ukraine and nuclear brinkmanship in Europe have triggered a profound and urgent strategic reassessment across the Atlantic Alliance. The long-postulated peace dividend that followed the Cold War has vanished, replaced by a grim realization that the risk of major conflict on European soil is not a historical relic, but a present-day contingency. Senior officials are now publicly discussing timelines. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has warned that Russia could be ready to use military force against NATO within 5 years, an assessment echoed by German Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul, who cited intelligence suggesting Moscow is keeping open the option of war against NATO by 2029 at the latest. In the Baltic states, the consensus is even more immediate, with fears an attack could come within 3 years. This recognition has forced a fundamental shift in NATO military planning, moving from a posture of forward presence to one of forward defense. The horrific nature of the Russian occupation in Ukraine, documented by the UN and others to include systematic torture and the unlawful deportation of children, made the alliance's old tripwire concept politically and morally untenable. As Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas argued after the atrocities in Bucha were revealed, NATO's previous plan to potentially lose territory and liberate it months later was no longer acceptable. Defense had to be effective from the first moment. The challenge, however, is that capability has not kept pace with this new strategic imperative. A recent conference of defense insiders at London's Royal United Services Institute delivered a grim verdict. The United Kingdom and its allies are not prepared for a war that could come within the next few years. Senior research fellow Jack Watling warned of the peril of planning based on a wish list rather than reality. General Richard Behrens, the former head of UK Joint Forces Command, was more blunt. While the UK is moving in the right direction, at its current pace, it would take about 10 years to be ready for war. And Our analysis and our allies are saying to us, well, maybe you've got 3 to 5 years, he stated, identifying the gap as a matter of will, societal as much as political. The required transformation is comprehensive, touching every facet of society. It involves rethinking the resilience of critical infrastructure, building up armed forces and reserves, investing in defense industry capacity, and preparing civil society for the possibility of conflict, a message underscored when France's armed forces chief, General Fabien Mandin, told the public the nation must accept losing its children to defend itself. Financially, the change is already dramatic. Spurred by the invasion and sustained U.S. pressure, NATO's European members have radically increased defense spending. Where only 6 met the alliance's 2% of GDP target in 2021, 31 of 32 are projected to do so this year. In a landmark decision, members agreed in June to raise the target to 5% of GDP by 2035. Public opinion surveys indicate a foundational shift in awareness, with 78% of Europeans expressing concern about the EU's defense and security over the next 5 years. This is translating into concrete national measures. Sweden and Finland have distributed total defense handbooks to households. Lithuania, Latvia, and Sweden have reintroduced conscription. And Germany, Poland, and others have launched voluntary military training programs. At the nuclear level, European powers are also adjusting. In a significant move, France and the United Kingdom issued the Northwood Declaration in July 2025, stating that there is no extreme threat to Europe that would not prompt a response by our two nations, and that their independent nuclear forces can be coordinated and contribute significantly to the overall security of the alliance. This represents a conscious effort to bolster the European pillar of nuclear deterrence amid concerns over U.S. commitment and the stark Russian threat. Beneath the surface of Russian military pressure and nuclear threats, a deeper historical dynamic is at work, one that suggests the Kremlin's position may be less secure than its aggressive posture implies. Analysts drawing parallels with Russia's past see the war in Ukraine not as a triumphant reclamation, but as the latest manifestation of an imperial trap, a pattern where overconfident Russian leaders launch wars of conquest, only to be ground down by unforeseen resistance, international opposition, and the internal weaknesses of their own system. The Crimean War, 1853-56, the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-05, and the Soviet-Afghan War, 1979-88, all serve as potent analogies. In each, Russia underestimated its foe, downplayed the risk of foreign involvement, and eventually found the economic and human costs unsustainable, leading to military defeat and, in several cases, profound internal political upheaval. President Vladimir Putin's invasion has followed a disturbingly similar script of hubris. The Kremlin expected a rapid capitulation in Kyiv, not a years-long war of attrition. It anticipated Western sanctions, but not their durability or the extent of military support for Ukraine. While the Russian state has shown a grim capacity to adapt, shifting to a war economy, leveraging global partnerships to bypass sanctions, and recruiting soldiers through financial incentives rather than a general mobilization. These are mitigating actions, not solutions to structural flaws. The strains are accumulating. Despite holding battlefield initiative, Russian advances have been glacial, often measured in meters, at a cost. Western intelligence estimates at upwards of 25,000 casualties per month, and total casualties likely exceeding 1 million. This hemorrhaging of human capital exacerbates Russia's pre-existing demographic crisis, leading the state statistics agency to cease publishing monthly demographic data. The war economy, while producing drones and artillery shells at scale, is mortgaging the nation's future, diverting capital and labor from productive civilian sectors and hollowing out long-term economic prospects. Perhaps most tellingly, the Kremlin's newfound willingness to engage in substantive diplomacy, as seen in the review of the U.S.-Ukrainian peace plan, may itself be a signal of underlying pressure. It suggests a desire to lock in gains at the negotiating table while the military situation remains favorable before the accumulating costs at home reach a destabilizing crescendo. This historical lens reveals a central paradox of the current moment. Russia appears simultaneously as an aggressive, intimidating power, and as a state potentially ensnared in a long-term struggle, it cannot cleanly win or easily abandon. The immediate human and environmental toll of the war continues to mount in stark, painful detail. Beyond the headlines from Moscow and the negotiating rooms, the daily reality for Ukrainians is one of relentless bombardment and tragic loss. The sunflower oil spill fouling the shores near Odessa is just one incident in a systematic campaign against ecological and civilian infrastructure. In the diplomatic sphere, the human cost is reflected in points of the peace plan, calling for the immediate release of all prisoners detained since 2014 and the return of deported children and civilians. On the ground, the war's brutal legal asymmetries persist, as seen in the 19-year prison sentence handed down by a Russian-backed court in occupied Donetsk to a Colombian national, Oscar Mauricio Blanco Lopez, for fighting with the Ukrainian army. Meanwhile, within Russia itself, the state extends its long arm of repression beyond its borders, as a Moscow court schedules an in absentia trial for German sculptor Jacques Tilly, accused of discrediting the military through satirical carnival floats depicting President Putin. These disparate fragments, environmental damage, judicial repression, and cultural censorship illustrate the war's totality, a conflict that spills across borders, into ecosystems, and into the very fabric of civil society. As December draws to a close, the competing vectors of escalation and diplomacy have created a moment of extraordinary tension and uncertainty. The successful Ukrainian drone and sabotage campaign reaching into central Moscow demonstrates a capability and a will to strike back directly at Russian symbols of authority, raising the stakes of the conflict to a new level. Concurrently, the existence of a detailed 20-point U.S.-Ukrainian peace plan, now awaiting a formal Russian response, provides the most concrete roadmap for ending the violence that has yet appeared. The two developments are inextricably linked. The military pressure applied by Ukraine is likely viewed in Kyiv as essential to securing a favorable diplomatic outcome, while the Kremlin may see its own escalation in Odessa and its nuclear posturing as leverage to extract concessions at the negotiating table. The international community holds its breath, watching to see whether the Russian response to the peace plan will be a serious counterproposal or a flat rejection. The signals from the Russian public, as measured by state pollster VT's IOM, suggest a populace weary of conflict, with a majority expecting the war to end in 2026 and linking hopes for a more successful year to its conclusion. This public sentiment may form an invisible boundary on the Kremlin's room for maneuver. The strategic landscape of Europe has been irrevocably altered. The alliance is stronger and more united in purpose than before the invasion, with Finland and Sweden now members and defense spending soaring. Yet, it is also more acutely aware of its vulnerabilities, racing to convert economic resources into credible military deterrence along a massively extended border with Russia. The nuclear shadow has lengthened, with Russian weapons stationed in Belarus and doctrine rewritten to threaten their use in a wider set of circumstances. The question that hangs over the continent is whether the current crisis will culminate in a precarious peace forged from difficult compromises, or whether the escalating actions, the strikes on ports and capitals, the nuclear deployments, the relentless attrition will precipitate a wider, even more catastrophic confrontation. The lessons of history caution that wars launched by imperial overreach often end in the exhaustion and transformation of the aggressor state. The imperative of the present is to manage a confrontation with a nuclear-armed power in a way that avoids a historic catastrophe while preserving the sovereignty of nations. In his Christmas address, President Zelensky sought to capture the weary resilience of his nation. It hardly matters what dishes are on the table. What matters is who is at the table. As the new year approaches, the world waits to see who will remain at the table of negotiation and at what price a seat can be secured. The strategic initiative along the front line, as declared by the Russian president, is being operationalized through a grinding, multi-pronged offensive that seeks to stretch and snap Ukrainian defenses. While the capture of individual settlements, the Russian military command is leveraging a significant military manpower advantage to be the systematic degradation of Ukraine's capacity to function as a sovereign concentrated in the theater Defense of Minister Andrei Belousov has presented being applied across a vast front campaign to create reporting that over the past security buffer zone, Ukrainian forces have lost nearly 500,000 soldiers. Fierce battles continue Russian strikes to cripple the nation's energy infrastructure, pressure preventing down Ukrainian forces from resting or reconstituting their most depleted facilities. A key part of this strategy is particularly during winter transcends immediate Putin has publicly acknowledged it is a weaponization of participating in operations aimed at breaking civilian morale, marking a profound deepening of that partnership. In cities like Kyiv, Russia reports power generation capacity has been reduced by more than 410,000 forcing a precarious reliance on under contract electricity and mobile sustaining the war effort without a general mobilization. Pressure on the home front is designed to collapse the war has accelerated economic foundations upon which the military the intensity of Ukrainian long-range drone strikes has dramatically increased, met by Russian air defense claims of a high interception rate. The Russian military is pushing for deeper integration of artificial intelligence and robotics. This focus extends to strategic weaponry, with the imminent deployment of new systems like the Oreshnik missile, framed as essential for future security. However, this narrative of progress masks turbulent realities within the Russian power structure. The appointment of civilian economist Andrei Belousov as defense minister signaled systemic change, projecting an image of a pragmatic technocrat. Yet, his celebrated commitment to truth was quickly tested and revealed to be a flexible instrument of statecraft. His true mission appears to be centralizing control, notably co-opting independent military bloggers to sanitize information flow. This centralization occurs within a system where ultra-powerful cliques, like Rosneft's Igor Sechin, operate with impunity, using corporate security assets to enforce their will. In this environment, Belousov's role is to optimize the war machine within a framework where corporate state entities wield quasi-sovereign power. Against this backdrop of internal intrigue, Russia's nuclear rhetoric serves as psychological warfare. The relentless unveiling of new strategic weapons projects an image of invincibility domestically while aiming to menace Western capitals internationally. Many Western analysts interpret this not as overwhelming strength, but as a mask for conventional weakness, a tool to fracture NATO unity and deter advanced weaponry deliveries by raising the specter of escalation. Europe's response has evolved into a grim, urgent adaptation. Intelligence assessments warning of a potential direct conflict within years have triggered a fundamental shift from forward presence to forward defense. The gap between recognition and readiness is stark, with military experts warning that preparedness lags behind the threat. This has spurred a dramatic increase in defense spending across NATO and a societal shift towards concepts of total defense and civilian resilience. Globally, the war's aftershocks are destabilizing norms. The deepening Russia-North Korea axis undermines non-proliferation, while attacks on Ukrainian grain exports weaponize global food security. The deliberate erosion of red lines, including attacks on nuclear facilities and the deportation of children, represents a rejection of post-World War II humanitarian frameworks. As the conflict continues, the trajectories are locked in a dangerous loop. The key may lie in interpreting Moscow's signals. The relentless intimidation likely projects strength to conceal strategic anxiety. The coming period will test Ukraine's resilience, Europe's cohesion, and the Kremlin's patience, with the outcome defining the international order for the 21st century.